Ladies and gentlemen, the program will begin momentarily. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the host of Courageous Conversations, Michelle Ray.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Michelle Ray, Executive Director of the Walter Cates Foundation. I'm really pleased to welcome you to episode 3 of our virtual mini-series called Courageous Conversations. Each event in this series has and will feature thought-provoking and action-inspiring talks that are really essential for anyone who's driving diversity and inclusion inside and outside of their respective organizations. But before we get started today, I would like to acknowledge the generous support and steadfast commitment of our sponsors. I would first like to recognize our official sponsors. They are Charter Communications and Comcast NBC Universal. Our benefactors are A&E, Cox Communications, and ESPN. And our contributors are AMC Networks, CommScope, Discovery Communications, Univision, Viacom CBS, and Warner Media. And we also like to thank our many advocates, friends, allies, and partners. It is through their generous support that we're able to do the work that we do. We have an exciting program on deck for you today. So before we dive in, I would be remiss if I did not mention that today has been declared a virtual day of action and a day of healing to stop #StopAsianHate. Asian Americans have faced anti-Asian racism for many years here in America and around the world, but this recent spike in violent acts and hate against Asians in the US has been deeply disturbing for me personally and for our industry at large. This is why the cable industry has rallied together with the Asian Pacific American Institute for Congressional Studies to demonstrate solidarity on this very day, March 16, 2021. As you know, at the Walter Cates Foundation, we work to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion. And this work is rooted in anti-racist principles. So I call on everyone to be an ally, to lend your voice against hate. Now, because inclusion is multifaceted, it is one of the many reasons we're here today. And today we're championing disability inclusion. As you know, disabled people are often forgotten in conversations around DEI, which is why it's so critical to turn our attention to this issue. And today we've gathered a very dynamic group of leaders and experts in the disability community that will help to inform and educate all of us, self-included. And leading this conversation is our very respected moderator, Marianne Howland. Marianne is the founder and CEO of IBIS Communications, as well as the Global Diversity Leadership Exchange. And for more than 2 decades, she has led branding and multicultural marketing efforts for cable industry brands, including Scripps Network, BT, TV1, NAMIC, and of course, our very own Walter Cates Foundation. Marianne is a frontline advocate for disability justice. She is inspired by her own son who has cerebral palsy and ADHD. She often describes him as a fire hose of talent, creativity, and compassion. And in fact, she wrote a very personal memoir about raising her son, which is titled Warrior Rising: How 4 Men Helped a Boy on His Journey to Manhood. It is a great read. And so I'm delighted to have Marianne join us today to help guide us through this courageous conversation on disability inclusion. But as we bring Marianne onto the stage, I'd like to encourage you to be a part of today's conversation. So please feel free to submit your questions throughout the discussion, simply by using the Q&A tab, which is located in your Zoom window. We'll do our very best to get to your questions. And for the deaf and hard of hearing, you may have noticed that we have an ASL interpreter. In fact, we'll have 2 interpreters with us today, and I thank them so much for joining us. And because we believe in practicing what we preach, we also have provided an option for you to turn on closed captioning, only if you prefer. And for the blind and visually impaired, we will use self-descriptions in our introductions. So for instance, I may say, this is Michelle. So without further ado, Let's bring on Marianne to kick off today's conversation. And welcome, Marianne, and thank you for joining.
Thank you, Michelle, for that wonderful introduction. I am Marianne Howland. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I'm African-American. I have natural dark brown and gray locks that hang to below my waist. Today, I'm wearing black cat-eye glasses, a black and white blouse, my favorite large gold circle earrings, and a big gap-toothed smile. I'd like to welcome our audience to our courageous conversation on disability and inclusion. Before I introduce our panelists, however, I'd like to paint the landscape of our topic with some startling facts. According to a 2018 CDC morbidity and mortality report, over 1 billion people, or around 15% of the world's population, have some form of disability. And according to one study, the total disposable income of the community tops $8 trillion per year. Now, for context, that makes the community the third largest in the world in terms of purchasing power after the US and China. And in the US alone, 1 in 4 adults have a disability that impacts major life activities. And surprisingly, 33% of 20-year-old workers will become disabled before even reaching retirement age. Rates of disability are increasing due to aging and increases in chronic health conditions. We simply can no longer ignore such a mass swath of our global market, particularly in a time of hyper competition. Unfortunately, people are so afraid of disability, yet it's just another human life experience, and one that we will all have as we age. I come to this experience as a mother, teacher, nurse, therapist, advocate, and career mentor of my own son, an African-American male with cerebral palsy and ADHD, so both a neural and physical disability. Our lived experience has taught us that indeed the world of disabilities is nuanced and complex. So where do we start? Well, here with us are 4 exceptional human beings, leading the way to a world of full inclusion in cross-cultural communications, in sports, and in the entertainment industries in the US and global markets. Candace Cable is a 9-time Paralympian and also is a disability, diversity, and equity and inclusion consultant. Steve Raymond is Vice President of Accessibility Product and Technology at Charter Communications. Billy Sanders is the founder of Bridges Consulting, a nationally certified interpreter, and teaches American Sign Language systems, and strategies for cross-cultural communication. And last but not least, Gail Williamson is a talent agent at Kazarian Measures Ruskin and Associates, or KMR, and leads their diversity department specializing in talent with disabilities. Thank you, Candace, Steve, Billy, and Gail for joining us here today. Now, we'd like to give our audience a chance to get to know a little bit more about each of you and how you came to help lead the business community in this paradigm shift to full inclusion. So I invite each of you to briefly share a little bit about what you do in your own personal story. And so Candace, let's start with you. What's it like to be a Paralympian? And can you tell us about your journey from the Paralympics to your work as a consultant?
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Marianne. This is Candace. And I'd like to thank the Cates Foundation for inviting me to be here and to be a part of this panel. It's really fun to be a part of a group of people that are on the cutting edge of creating equity and inclusion for people. I'm zooming in from the occupied traditional lands of the Tongva Nation, also known as Los Angeles, and my pronouns are she and her. My description is, for those that don't see me, is I am a white-skinned woman. I'm wearing black rimmed glasses, and I have brown shoulder length hair, and I have a red collared shirt on. And I'm sitting in my wheelchair. I use a wheelchair for mobility from a spinal cord injury in 1975 at the age of 21. I wasn't an athlete before my spinal cord injury. I really was a kid that just loved to be out and run around with my friends and, as a person who's white, I had a lot of opportunities that I didn't really ever think about anything that I couldn't do. And I wanted to do everything. So growing up, I never really said, I want to be this or I want to be that. I wanted to try a lot of things, which has pretty much been the trajectory of my life. But at the age of 21, I was in a car accident that resulted in a spinal cord injury. And that was 1975. And after that injury, I started to interact with other people with disabilities. And I realized that I wanted to be a part of that community. I wanted to be a part of what they were doing. And sports was something that was being invented in the early to mid 70s. And I became a pioneer of the sport of wheelchair racing, which resulted in a 27-year career as a Paralympic athlete in 3 sports, winter and summer. I won 14 medals, 2 Olympic medals, Olympic exhibition events on the track, as well as 12 medals in the Paralympics. That springboarded me into what I realized was an advocacy life, that I was going to really live my life with focus on creating equity and opportunity in every aspect that I could. And so I started to develop a teaching program that I like to call Understanding the Experience of Disability. And it runs the gamut. It's from all the different kinds of disabilities, the language, the laws, the sports, all the different aspects of what to do and what not to do. And it really helps dismantle our bias and our uncertainties as well as our fears. And I have one for kids and I have one for adults. And then I transitioned into writing more and working with multiple organizations on creating access and equity. So I've worked with the Christopher Reeve Foundation for many years, Open Doors organization that creates travel and tourism equity, UNICEF, the State Department Speaker and Specialist Program. I was the director of Paralympic and Disability Engagement for the LA 2028 bid, and we're bringing the games to Los Angeles, which is super exciting. I want to, I think, stop there because I have a really long list. I'm really old, so I could go on and on, and I know we have limited time. So thank you so much for letting me introduce myself.
And thank you, Candace. And yes, we'll have plenty of opportunity for you to talk more about all that you bring to this table and this conversation. So this is Marianne speaking again. So Steve, you've had a long career in accessibility and universal design. Can you tell us how you came to it and how it brought you to a leadership role in disability inclusion today?
Sure. This is Steve Raymond. Thanks, Marianne. Really excited to be part of this panel and to see the great Candace Cable, who I've known for many years on her Paralympic journey and on the winter side. So it's awesome to see her. So I'm now Vice President of Accessibility at Charter Communications, and I lead a team to ensure that all the products and services that we launch consider the full range of the human diversity, respectability, language, culture, gender, age, and other forms of human difference. It's very exciting to be part of a very talented team here. I just joined in July. I spent a lot of my career in telecommunications at different programmers. I spent over 25 years at Disney and ESPN Media Networks, and I spent 4 years at AT&T Sportsnet. So I've really kind of been in the traditional, say, programmer role. But what got me into accessibility was I started my career at a low power TV station in Vail, Colorado, basically being a ski bum right out of college, but had a real job, skiing 100 days a year. But I met some guys, and one of them became my good friend, Bob Meserve, who was paralyzed in a ski accident. He went through his spinal cord rehabilitation in Craig Hospital here in Denver. And we became good friends. I watched him say, I'm going to get on a ski again, and was one of the pioneers of adaptive skiing. And it really had a great impact on me because his dedication to the sport and the challenges that he faced day to day, being a wheelchair user in a world that was not set up for him, traveling the world, being a ski racer, had a big impact on me. So I started this organization called Adaptive Spirit as one of the co-founders that started that 25 years ago to raise money for that time, the U.S. Disabled Ski Team. Well, now we're under U.S. Paralympics, and we've grown to be one of the largest fundraisers, I think, in the world for Paralympic sport. And it's really supported by the cable industry and a lot of the sponsors that you listed earlier are part of the Adaptive Spirit family. So it's a big passion of mine to support people with disabilities and find ways that we can continue to improve the inclusive experience for all. And that really excited to be part of Charter that you mentioned universal design. That's how we think about life right now here, is make sure that our employees and customer experiences are built for everyone.
Thank you, Steve. Marianne speaking again. Billy, as an educator, an activist, and a Black man who can sign, you have become somewhat of a cultural icon, a unicorn, if you will, in this space, right? And I met you at a hashtag ASL Bay that was trending at a Busboys and Poets event not too long ago. Now, can you tell us how and why did you become involved in your work with the community of people with disabilities?
Thank you for having me. I am Billy Sanders, not the ASL Bay, but it's all love. I am a product of deaf ingenuity. My mom, who was deaf, noted scholar, let me tell the story, okay? But, we grew up in St. Paul, Minnesota, where I was born, even though my mother was born in New Orleans, Louisiana. She was the first Black deaf student that went to the white school for the deaf in Louisiana. But it was unheralded because she was Creole and could pass for white. So though she originally went to the Black school for the deaf, she got kicked out because she was always fighting. She was a tomboy, she was fighting. She gets kicked out of school. What do we do with this young Black deaf girl? Well, my grandparents, who are also Creole, who could also pass for white, had this novel idea. Let's take Deborah onto the white school and sneak her in as a white deaf student. Grandiose idea. It worked, but nobody knew sign language, so nobody told my mom the plan. So they get her there, right? Get her into school, and the kids on the playground recognized that she was signing Black ASL. They outed her on the playground. And of course, my mom, indignant and prideful in her own, self-respect, was like, yes, I'm Black. What are you talking about? Of course I'm signing Black ASL. Gets kicked out of the white school for the deaf, not for fighting, but for being a Black girl. My grandparents begged the school, please don't kick her out. Keep her in the school and we won't say a word. We won't even publicize it. We won't do anything. They allowed her to stay, though she could not be in classroom with her peers. She had to be in classes by herself. So that created a scarring effect. And I keep that in mind as she still persevered throughout school. So when I say I'm a product of deaf ingenuity, that's a determination that I still see throughout today within the larger construct of the Black deaf community. I, by happenstance, became a sign language interpreter. That's what I do here in Washington, DC, even though that is not my current location, as you see, I'm a particular resort. But I absolutely love being on the front line of justice and accessibility. I am the live embodiment of the Americans with Disabilities Act. I am all for the expansion of what accessibility, how that leads to equity and deaf participation in the American construct of what's being a contributing member of society can truly be. I absolutely love what I do day in and day out. There is no day that is like the day before or the day after. And so when I'm paired with people on this panel, I'm very honored. But I want to cut this short and get into the language justice movement. That is what we're here for. That is what I am here for, to promote what our call to action truly is and how we can all be great right where we are.
Thank you, Billy. I really appreciate that. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that social justice aspect, which I find is so relevant in the conversation that we're all having today around full inclusion. But let's now invite Gail to tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thank you very much. I'm Gail Williamson. My pronouns are she, her, and her. I am a white-skinned grandma with a gray pixie cut, wearing a gray sweater today. I am a talent agent at Kazari Measures Ruskin and Associates in their diversity department. And we started their diversity department specifically to work with performers with disabilities to meet the needs of casting performers with disabilities, but also to push the social justice of inclusion for characters with disabilities. You know, why can't the judge be in a wheelchair? Sort of conversation is what we have. We also do a lot of educating to how to include and all that good stuff. I got to this point, I started 30 years ago with the California Governor's Committee for Employment of People with Disabilities in their media access office. And there we were advocates for television and film and media inclusion. And from that, I ended up where I am today. And all this started because I have a son with Down syndrome. And when he was 10, he got a commercial through Special Olympics. And that was my first introduction to the entertainment industry. And he did very well. And as a mother, I wanted to pursue whatever my child enjoyed and excelled at. And in trying to find him an agent and find him a path, I ran into a lot of resistance. And so that's how I started volunteering originally for the Media Access Office. So I often say that following my son's passion, I sort of stumbled into my own destiny.
Yeah, so I can so totally relate to that, Gail. That's exactly how I came into this as well as a mom. Well, it's a joy to know that all of you are on the front line of a new frontier in full inclusion. And as we all know, it takes a tremendous amount of patience, tenacity, and courage to create a paradigm shift in culture and attitudes, especially when that history is pervasive and multi-generational. So let's start the conversation. And Candace, I'm going to start with you with a two-part question. And if you could be as brief as you can. You have made your lived experience and your sport platform a perfect automatic door opener to dismantling ableism, racism, and negative stigmas that disabled people experience daily, much of it based on myths. What do companies need to know about the lived experience of people with disabilities?
This is Candace. Thank you, Marianne, for that question. And I want to ask the audience, though, to take a breath and relax, because these are uncomfortable conversations and things that we're talking about, because we're not used to seeing disabled people in the world. And to answer your question about how I found my way to my mission, well, first it was about me. It was personal. I was experiencing the biases and the oppressions directed at disabled people because I'm living an authentic, visible, lived experience as a disabled person in society, and I wanted equity in a society space. And I say visible because, when Marianne talked about the stats of 1 billion people with disabilities, that's really only 1 billion people that have disclosed they have disabilities. Most people with non-visible disabilities aren't disclosing they have disabilities because they don't want to feel the fear or the oppression or the bias that comes forward when someone does disclose they have a disability, and it happens often. And then I went from it being personal to realizing that what affects other marginalized communities affects mine and me. And then I realized my participation in white supremacy, because I'm white, and in the systemic institutional racism. And the disability community has racism and white supremacy. It's why we have a disability justice movement. And then I learned, because I needed to be educated, is that ableism is birthed from racism. And I had the full-on head blown emoji when I heard that, because I thought they were so different, and they weren't. I like to reference TL definition of ableism, and I'm not going to read it. I've created a list of resources as a takeaway for everyone that I know that the Cates Foundation will be making available through email to everyone. So I'm just going to give you the basic tenet of it, is that the idea of ableism is that some bodies are more valuable than other bodies. And it's everywhere. It's in all of our systems. It's absolutely everywhere. And so what I do is I educate myself, and then I check in with my Black and Indigenous and people of color peers for clarity. And then I amplify their messages of equality and equity, as well as my messages around disability too, so that we can build an equitable community. You know, it's a culture change. It has to happen in a society if we want diversity, equity, and inclusion to work. Now, here's an idea to think about when we consider disabled people and culture, and why we don't fit in very well, and why there's so much to do. We disabled people have only been out since the mid 20th century, the 1950s and the 1960s. Before that, we were either hidden away, institutionalized, or killed. And I know people are thinking, no way, but there are places in this world still that institutionalize people with disabilities and kill them. My first Paralympic Games was 1980. Those games were held in Moscow, just as the Olympic Games. But the Soviets said they didn't have any disabled people, so they weren't going to hold the Paralympic Games. And I implore you all to go and take a look at the Netflix film Rising Phoenix, because they talk about these 1980 games. So my spinal cord injury was in 1975. And if we think about it, the Civil Rights Acts were written in the 1960s. They didn't include disabled people because we weren't around. We didn't have any civil rights. Then in the early 70s, the 504 Rehabilitation Act was written in 1973 to create some access rights for people with disabilities. But the federal government didn't write the regulations, and they kept putting it off, and it couldn't be enforced. So in 1977, disabled people took over federal buildings all over this country. They had sit-ins. All of them failed, except for the one in San Francisco. And to this day, it's still the longest takeover of a federal building ever in this nation. Did you know that? No, because there is no disability history written in school books. We aren't familiar with that. Well, the regulations got signed. And on the resource list that you're gonna get, there's a television show called Drunk History. And they created an episode at my bidding called 504 that talks about what happened there. But basically, our civil rights really didn't come forward until 1990 with the Americans with Disabilities Act. And it's a civil rights law. It's not just a guide of how to create access. One of the problems with the ADA is that it doesn't have real teeth. We either litigate or we educate. I choose to educate, but litigation creates resentment and anger. So with the human rights documents, as we move forward in this timeline from the 1940s, nope, people with disabilities were never included in human rights documents, not until 2006, when the Convention on Rights for Persons with Disabilities was written. Only then were human rights for people with disabilities brought forward. So much of human history around people with disabilities, we haven't been a part of it. We just haven't been a part of human history. And it's one of the reasons why I believe it's really difficult for people to really wrap their heads around the bias and the stigma and the stereotypes that they've bought into unknowingly in many cases around disability, and they create exclusion. So I'll stop with a disability as a human life experience that we're all gonna have, as Marianne said, and it's really in your best interest to create equitable change now.
Well, thank you. Yes, there's so much history that we all don't know. And thank you for sharing those resources, Candace. And I know that the many conversations that we've had on this topic have been very enlightening. And so thank you for sharing all that. But one of the things that you said in your remarks was about our uncomfortability around disclosing our disabilities, which has a direct impact on workforce and implications in a workforce environment. So I want to explore that a little bit. And Billy, I want to ask you this question with regard to the deaf community. So what can companies do to sort of shift the culture towards full inclusion in their everyday practices that works to achieve that, or maybe mitigate the necessity for disclosure?
Thank you for asking. Before I start, well, as I start, I want to make note that I do not speak on behalf of the deaf community in the least bit. I advocate for the benefit of the deaf community, but I never want to position myself or privilege myself as a beacon of a representative of the deaf community. So that's just, I don't want my mom coming after me after today. Like, but nevertheless, also, en route to answer your question, I want to recognize the Cates Foundation. Did I pronounce it right?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. So that's Michelle, Jennifer, other people behind the scenes, even yourself, Marianne, for taking the courage to provide ASL or American Sign Language interpretation today. If I can also add what Candace so boldly stated, which I really appreciate, is the ineffectiveness of the ADA. Okay, ADA is, in my view, America's minimum wage contract with disabled America. Right? It is the least amount barrier that we are all held accountable to. Right? So in that case, the ADA does not demand that the Cates Foundation provides accessibility. So you have to be courageous enough to provide it beyond what the federal government states. And because of that, I honor you for taking that courageous step. What COVID has exposed is the power of the people. Yes, we are all dealing with catastrophic situations and environments that we're not accustomed to. However, what it has done was empower us with the ability to say, hey, we can decide if we're going to provide accessibility and access. We can decide if we're going to provide equity as we rebuild what our engagement is going to be. So now that we're providing this virtual platform, you think first to say, hey, well, regardless of what the ADA says or even doesn't state, we're going to create what accessibility is in this platform moving forward. That's what the courage is, right? And so for all of you who have yet to get on the train, okay, of this language justice movement, because if I cannot speak or be heard, whether in sign or in voice, then what is equity to me? Right? Therefore, I would like you all to become familiar, as far as America is concerned, with the Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf. That is the national registry of all certified and some non-certified interpreters. Okay, that is www.rid.org. Okay, you can find some of the most finest of interpreters that you see on the screen today on RID's website. You can also find some interpreting agencies if you want to contract your services out in a general sense or a private sense. And that alleviates you all having to contact me right after this event, because I don't have all the answers as to who you're contacting. You might be in Arizona. I don't know who's in Arizona, but RID does. Okay. But nevertheless, I would like all of you to become acclimated with not only the Americans with Disabilities Act. If you go to rid.org, we have what's called standard practice papers, right? And that is what our best practices are on how you can engage with what accessibility is and not feel like you're the only white woman at the Black Poetry show, right? Like you can feel like everybody's on the same page. And that is what the standard practice papers does. And it empowers everybody with the tools needed to provide a space that my mom can hold voice, that my mom can state what she states, that my mom can feel like she can apply for any position that is available and not feel like my deafness is going to be a barrier, right? My communication access when I get this interview is going to be a barrier, or I need to state that I'm deaf first so I can, lessen the blow. She doesn't have to worry about any of that because we are all taking this courageous step to put us all on the same page. That is truly what equity is. But I don't want to sound like the angry Black man, but I do want to empower you all and encourage you all that you're making the right step. Conversations are important, but action is far more effective.
Thank you, Billy. Really appreciate that, and total respect that we're not asking you to speak on behalf of the deaf community, but because you have such a personal connected experience, you have enlightened us. So you bring value to the conversation to share with us what you have learned. And next, Gail. So I've got a two-part question for you. Now Candace was giving a bit of history, but you have history in yet a different industry, which is relevant for our audience today, so relevant, which is in an entertainment business, and you've been in it for over 30 years. So my question to you is, have you seen any change in the industry with regard to disability inclusion, and why is full inclusion important for the entertainment industry?
Well, first I have to say, yeah, I've seen change. There's people like Candace speaking out, and thank you. On 504, I had several people work, including Ali Stroker playing Judy Heumann. And then I believe we had someone make a comment that Crip Camp also does a great story about 504. And Crip Camp is a documentary that is nominated this year for an Academy Award, so you can see it. But anyway, sorry, I kind of took it off there from where you asked me, Marianne, I'm sorry. But basically, why is inclusion important in the entertainment industry? And what have I seen in changes?
Yes.
You know, I have a personal experience that led me to where I am. My son with Down syndrome was born in 1979. And I could walk into a restaurant with him on my hip and silence it, because you didn't take children with Down syndrome out in public at that time. I was at Universal Studios with a backpack on my back with Blair in it. And someone came up to me and said, oh, I have one of those at home. And I said, a backpack? And she said, no, a child like that, but I live in South Africa and we just don't take them out in public. So that was kind of interesting to me, that I was living in a world where my child was not necessarily welcomed. People would start to talk to him when they saw the back of him. And then when he'd turn around and look at them and they'd see his face, they'd stop the conversation. But then a little show called Life Goes On came on the air. And it starred Chris Burke, who was an actor with Down syndrome. And this was a time, for those of you that are young and don't know this time, we only had 5 channels. So if you didn't watch a show, you at least knew about the show because you saw commercials on it. And Life Goes On taught the world that they could talk to the face of Down syndrome and they could expect an answer and they could interact. And there are people who never met anyone with Down syndrome and didn't know that. Maybe all they had seen were, pictures of T4 in Germany and these children being hauled off to be exterminated, basically. So they didn't know what a person with Down syndrome was like. Suddenly we found first season, my son got role models that he hadn't had. He got to turn on TV and see himself, which was awesome. My son, his brother, got to see, sorry, dogs at my house. Is that okay? Not too loud? Anyway, got to see, oh geez, I'm so sorry. Got to see my son without Down syndrome, got to see that there were other siblings out there that loved their brother and kind of disdained their brother sometimes because it was portrayed on the show. And we found that about second season, we'd go out to dinner and waiters would ask Blair what he wanted to eat. So this was a big change in the world from one little television show that was invited into people's homes. No one had to pick up a picket sign. No one had to march on Washington. They just were able to see a life experience with someone with Down syndrome, which was wonderful. But in the changes now, I would say in the last 5 years, we've had much more happening than we had in the first 25 years. The first year I was at KMR in 2013, the 10 to 12 clients I had at the beginning collectively made $50,000. The clients with disabilities at KMR in 2019 collectively made $3 million. So that shows you that we're getting there, we're getting the increase. And I think a lot of it has to do with society too. We know that we didn't offer children with disabilities a public education until 1975. So we now finally have a generation of people, I think in executive offices, that have a little knowledge of disability where we never did before. So sort of this inclusion generation is upon us. And I think we need to take advantage of that to create these images and make it more inclusive in media, to make it more inclusive in the world and in employment and in education and all of those things.
Thank you, Gail. So we're getting close to the end, and the question and answers are flying in. But I wanted to get to this really interesting response that from Steve about, we learned in our prep call that Gail, Steve, and Candace were already connected prior to today. And that connection has everything to do with what's the exciting work that you're doing at Charter. So Steve, if you could tell us about that connection and tell us about how Charter is innovating in this space to, around this work of inclusion.
Absolutely. No, it was exciting to see Candace, and then understanding that Gail and I have something in common too, which I'll talk to is, we talked about compliance. I heard Billy say that, and Candace say that, we think about going beyond compliance. So that's the one thing cool about accessibility field right now is people want to innovate. There's some really cool work being done, inclusive work on product and technology that you design it for everyone, right? So we have a whole portfolio from apps to our products and services that are built with universal design with that in mind. But one product in particular that we acquired a company a couple of years ago called ActiveView, and it was an audio description service. And we rebranded it, did some work on it, and released it last May as Spectrum Access. So those of you that don't know what audio described programming is, I think it's the next kind of thing you're going to see from content companies in Hollywood. If you're a low vision or blind user, typically if you're a user of television, and there are lots, they're asking lots of questions, and I'm trying to understand what is going on between dialogue, right? So an audio description track is narration or description that is in between dialogue that can tell the viewer what is happening on screen. And we have got tons of great press, and our advocacy partners are really giving us great credit for releasing this app. We made a conscious decision not to make it authenticated Charter customers. It is free for anyone in the United States that wants to try it out. And so that was an important decision to get a lot of engagement. So we've been reaching out to our content partners. We have over 500 titles in the app. It's in an Android device. You can download it or an iOS device, and you hold it up to your TV, and it will basically, if that movie audio description track is in the app catalog, it'll sync with the TV. So the low vision or blind user can either put on earbuds and hear what's going on, and they can experience this with their sighted friends. So we actually built a brand spot, and this is the first time for Spectrum to have a person with a disability as the lead of a brand spot to talk about this app. So I would like to cue it up for you and show you. It describes what's going on. Then I know Gail will have a comment about that.
We see a vast desert of sand with distant hazy mountains. On a dusty road, a black car travels at speed. A man walks to the top of a large dune. He turns his head. Behind him, a band of armored vehicles waits to spring a trap.
Well, he's in trouble.
What happened?
At Spectrum, we think nothing beats movie night.
The man gives the signal to attack.
So the Spectrum Access app gives the visually impaired audio description on their phone, so nobody misses a thing.
All right. Yeah, we love that. We got a lot of good feedback. And then what I knew we went to an agency that would be authentic in helping find cast the right person. We have two people on my team. One is blind, Peter Kujarave, who is one of our outreach, and he was there on the casting site virtually. But I realized that guess who helped us place that actress? It's Gail. So, and then Natalie, who's her name, and Candace told me that she also has a great podcast, and she was terrific as an actress. We spent a lot of time thinking about language and talked to advocacy partners and how they'd be perceived. The cool thing about that is the roles were switched between the sighted person and Natalie. Typically, Natalie be the one asking the questions. Her sighted friend comes running in the room asking what's going on, but she knows because she has audio description on that movie track. So We love that, and we're going to continue to take that app and work with our content partners to add more content. The one thing we realized is a lot of people, when they make content, they don't think about this. So it's not part of the normal work stream. So we're working to get a lot more content added to Spectrum Access.
Thank you, Steve. You know, I've seen that commercial, and I paid attention to it, especially when I knew that, you know, it had the meaning that you had, you know, had developed that for Charter. So congratulations and thank you very much. So being mindful of the time, now's a good time to take questions from the audience. So let's see. I have a question. Is this available for live sports? She asks. She is a blind ex-NFL player who thirsts for this in live games.
For audio description, it's a great question. I think a lot of times, if you're watching or participating in a baseball telecast, there's a lot of description going on. Long fly ball, caught, so forth. But I think there could be more. That's a really good question. That's something that's worth exploring with some of our sports partners for sure.
Okay, well, there you go. So here's a question. This came in and people preparing to listen to your conversation today. The question is, how does the work in dismantling racist systems differ from the work of dismantling ableist systems? Candace, you wanna?
This is Candace. I'll jump into that. Well, this is my theory. This is all I'm bringing out here. Is that, and I said it before when I was speaking, was that we have to educate ourselves first and know that any discriminatory system needs to be dismantled, but racism and our systemic institutional racism, our white supremacy, must be dismantled. And it has to be dismantled first, because all the other isms will follow, is my theory. This is my theory. And it doesn't differ really that much beyond the idea that we have to immerse ourselves as white people in the work of dismantling racism. We have to do the work, because this is our stuff. We did this, and we have to take responsibility for it. And as I said before, ableism is birthed from racism. The idea that some bodies have more value than other bodies. And so by dismantling racism, we're going to dismantle ableism. One thing we need to pay attention to is our language and our words, the things that we talk about and how we talk. You know, ableistic terms are rife throughout all of our language, and being able to get that type of education about that. I would also add that you know, in the work that we do in dismantling discriminatory systems, we need to spend time with the people that live those systems, you know, that live with the discrimination that's directed at them. So we need to ask Black folk what it is. I check in with my peers all the time that are friends of mine that are Black or Indigenous or people of color. And I ask them, you know, am I on the right track? Is this going in the right direction? And they're like, and I can go and amplify. The other thing is with disability, you want people with authentic lived experience in positions, all leadership type positions, in every position that is available. We want people with disabilities visible. And people that have proximity to disability also have value too, because they have some lived experience with someone in their life. And so that whole piece comes in part of dismantling things. I mean, I would open it up to my other panelists to answer any pieces of it, because again, this is Candace's recipe.
It was a good answer, but I know that the connection between ableism and racism, and Billy spoke to this very well as well. They're directly related, but I know that you had an answer for that, so I thought I'd go to you. But to build on that, though, this is a really good question that's come in from Will Guerra asking, what can companies do today in their everyday practices to get to full inclusion? And that can be targeted to any one of you who want to take a whack at that question. Steve, you're at Charter. Why don't you might want to go first.
Yeah, it's a couple things there as far as, I mean, for my team, we have about half of our team has a disability. So if you're going to work, I think you have to have people that reflect that what we're trying to provide for that audience and be inclusive. And then we make sure that we understand kind of the metrics a little bit on this, that we know that if we provide an inclusive experience, we provide tools and accommodations for people, they're a loyal employee. When you look at, especially working from a large telecommunications company, you have typically some significant turnover in some areas with customer-facing jobs. If you provide those inclusive experiences, the right tools that are accessible, the right experience, guess what? You're going to retain an employee. And they feel good about that. So the numbers are there that prove out that if you take the time and the energy and make the work, it'll help business.
This is Candace, and I'd like to add something into that because Billy really brought this forward, the emotional labor that's involved for people with disabilities to be out in the world and a part of a world that is not inclusive, wasn't built for us, and we need to rebuild it. That we have to take that into consideration also. When we're trying to create an inclusive environment, we have to interact with the people, but we have to think about the emotional labor. We saw this happen during the pandemic. People with disabilities for decades have asked to work from home because of lack of transportation, accessible transportation, lack of access to communication devices and skills, all kinds of inaccessible offices. And they've been told over and over and over, no, you must come into this office. You must be here in present. And what we saw over the pandemic was everybody could work from home in their pajamas. To imagine what it takes for me as a person who uses a wheelchair with half of my body paralyzed to get out of my house in the morning is a really big process. To get out of bed, there are 6 steps that I do just to get my legs over the side of the bed to transfer into my wheelchair. Whereas someone who's non-disabled would just swing their legs over. So that's a lot of energy that people are having to put out with disabilities. So if we can create more welcoming environments that offer, what kind of accommodations that Steve talked about people would need to be able to work in this society the way we have it set up. And we're building a whole new society.
So thank you, Candace. I think we have time for just one more question. And several of them are coming in, questions like, how do we, as programmers, how do we ensure that the stories we tell on our networks are inclusive, respectful, and true to people with disabilities? Gail, do you want to provide a quick answer to that?
Well, there's some great organizations out there. One's Respectability. You can find them online, and they do consultation. They help you plan out how you want to do it and how it works. And you can in casting too. We often help educate people. But I would start with Respectability. Just look them up, and they have a toolkit. See what it's about.
Thank you, Gail. Thank you for keeping that brief too. So as a wrap, I want to give all of our panelists each a couple. Just if you can provide like just 1-2 quick tips for our audience on what you, as an individual or a company, can do differently to be more inclusive of people with disabilities. And we'll just start with Billy.
Thank you. Candace, much respect to you for juxtaposing your privilege as a white woman with your disadvantage as a woman with a disability. And you being able to use your privilege, right, to speak to those who don't even have a seat of privilege in their disability. That is amazing. For all of you at home or wherever you're viewing this from, you have to understand that you are a part of the power construct. You are at the cool table if you have the ability to hire, to fire, to promote, to elevate, to matriculate anyone from one position to another. You have the power. So if you want to be fully inclusive, then where are we recruiting from? Why are we not recruiting more from Gallaudet University? Some of the world's brightest people right there coming out of Gallaudet University, or the Rochester Institute for the Deaf. or I'm sorry, Rochester Institute of Technology for the Deaf, if I said it right. If I can include Janice, did I say it right? Is it RIT? Okay, whatever. So NTID. Okay, so, but these are some of the world's most scholarly, astute, deaf, brilliant minds come booming out of places with no access to opportunities that are not promoted to them or even open to them, because people just don't know what they don't know. It's not that people are not allowing deaf people to apply. It's just that they don't know where to look. But that is where you look, right? As far as inclusion, let's make sure that we are identifying each other by who we say we are, and not by who we think they are, or what we believe the politically correct response is. For example, it is deaf, D-E-A-F, not deaf, D-E-A-T-H. It is deaf, right? If you're looking at what I'm wearing, which I did not describe, I'm a young Black man, emphasize young, okay, with a black suit. This is a tuxedo suit, just stunting, but Black is in the lowercase b. If I spell Black with a capital B, you know I'm speaking of the cultural identifier that I associate myself with. Conversely, when I write deaf with a lowercase d, I'm speaking of the hearing loss in and of itself. When I spell deaf with a capital D, I'm speaking of my mother, who culturally identifies as a deaf Black woman, right? So we want to make sure that the naming game is of the utmost respect when we honor people who want to be recognized, and whether they choose to be honored, not the way we believe the American construct tells us what's politically correct. But sharing, part of caring, sharing, so I'm gonna turn that over to someone else. Thank you all so much.
Well, that we're going to leave it at that, because I think you spoke for all of us, and you were very eloquent, and thank you so much, Billy, because it seems we're out of time. But we just want to take a moment to thank our esteemed panelists, audience, for the great discussion today, and for you, the audience, for being here with us. And I'd like to leave you with something that Richard Branson said that I think is a really very important message for all of us. Disability can no longer be a conversation reserved for charity and health organizations. It's time more brands woke up to the collective benefits of understanding people with disabilities and their needs. There's a campaign called the Valuable 500 that was launched in Davos at the World Economic Forum, and that's a global movement about putting disability on the business leadership agenda. We hope that this conversation today helps you to make it become a part of yours. And now I'd like to turn it back over to our Executive Director of the Walter Cates Foundation, Michelle Ray. Thank you very much.
This is Michelle. Thank you so much, Marianne. And like Billy, I'd forgotten to provide you with my pronouns and self-description earlier. I actually should know better, because my own father is blind, and I've had to change my own interactions with him in order to accommodate his disability. So first of all, my pronouns are she, hers, her, and hers. And I'm a woman of mixed race with what I can only describe as maybe cafe au lait skin, shoulder length brown hair. And I'm today wearing a long sleeve black and white shirt paired with my favorite silver and gold necklace, and that is me. Now, back to the panel. I wanted to thank again, Marianne, our moderator, and of course, our gratitude goes out to Candace Cable, Steve Raymond, Billy Sanders, and of course, Gail Williams, our two interpreters who have stayed with us this whole time. So thank you to you both. I really appreciate you. And again, our sponsors who continue to help us and to support the work that we do. And for our virtual audience, I want to thank you for joining us today. This conversation could have gone on for another hour or so, but we know that this is not the end of our focus and our work around disability inclusion. So as we endeavor to do this work, I just stay tuned, and we'll be providing you obviously with resources at the conclusion of this panel discussion. And for your participation today, we're going to give 20 lucky Zoom participants a copy of Marianne's book, Warrior Rising. We'll follow up with you separately to let you know details about how to receive your books, so stay tuned. And for those of you with backstage passes, please don't go anywhere. And again, finally, for information about accessibility, please go and visit waltercates.org. There you will find the ability to subscribe to our newsletters, and it'll keep you abreast of our work and point you to the resources. So with that said, I want to leave you with one thing. It's what we call our call to action here at the Cates Foundation. And our call to action is really to remember that while words may inspire, only actions create real and lasting change. And today, in the wake of all that we're experiencing, I want you to remember that you must invest your time in educating yourself on diverse issues, diversify your hiring practices, and of course, support philanthropic and social justice organizations that of course align with your own beliefs. And of course, it's incumbent upon all of us to be brokers of change. And with that said, I want you to be safe, and please, as I want to say, walk good. Thank you.